Did Jesus really walk on water? What if he didn't? What if this is another one of those biblical metaphors? What would that do to your expectations of Jesus? This morning, I invite you all to think about your expectations of Jesus. Do you believe Jesus really could work miracles which broke the laws of nature, like walking on water? What effect might believing that have on your expectations of him? Now, for many of our fellow Christians, there's absolutely no problem with that. Why shouldn't Jesus be able to turn water into wine, or multiply loaves and fishes, or walk on water? Jesus can do anything he likes. After all, he's God. And he knows everything too. Jesus knows what people are thinking before they say it. Jesus knows what will happen to himself in the future too. After all, he's God. Jesus could even call down legions of angels from heaven if he wanted to. Now, if I believe this, I have a champion who will rescue me when I'm in danger or difficulty. I don't believe that many of us here today have quite that understanding of Jesus. But if there's even something of that in your view of Jesus, have you considered what that means for your belief in God? If Jesus could do those sorts of miracles, why doesn't he continue to do them today? And more importantly, why doesn't God? Why doesn't God rescue me in the difficult times in my life? This story of Jesus walking on water follows the one about Jesus feeding the crowds, where bread and fish were metaphors for his teachings. They were food for thought, or bread of heaven. And after the people were completely satisfied with what they received from Jesus, he sent them off in a boat. He sent them off in a boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He then farewelled the crowds, probably with a blessing of some kind, and then went away from them to pray. Jesus' actions were very deliberate. The story says he did not want anyone else with him when he took time out to pray. The Gospels all agree that Jesus took special care to have uninterrupted time with God. They all present a clear picture of Jesus' reliance on prayer. Given Jesus' calling to bring disturbing and risky teaching in those dangerous times, how can we doubt that he needed the strength and guidance of God? So let's keep going with the story. When the sun sets and the evening comes, Jesus is still separated from his disciples while he communes with God. Apparently, there's a strong wind over the Sea of Galilee, because Matthew says that by now the boat carrying the disciples is a long way from land, and battered by the waves. And by now there's an unreachable distance between the disciples and Jesus. The watery void between them means they are completely separated from him in spirit as well as in body. So they're struggling to survive. At this point, we need to remember that for the ancients, the sea was a place of nameless evils which threatened to separate them from God. And we also need to remember that Matthew's Gospel was written for Jesus' followers about 40 years after he died. So its first readers were not only separated from Jesus by the distance between life and death, but also by the distance of time. In this story, the waves on the sea represent the difficulties the disciples encounter without Jesus. So once again, we are in the territory of metaphor, and it is through metaphor that we can plumb the depths of meaning in this story. All through the night of their fears, the disciples struggle against the dangers of the world, represented by the winds and the waves. They also struggle with their fear about carrying on Jesus' mission without his close guidance. But then they find they're not alone. Early in the morning, when human strength is at its lowest ebb and fears and worries are strongest, the story simply says, he came walking toward them on the sea. He came walking toward them on the sea. No doubt the first readers of the Gospel had already been told that Jesus lived on in some way after death. Who knows how they understood that? Perhaps it was threatening to them. In any case, the Gospel writer says that as the disciples were struggling on the sea of life, they recognized Jesus' presence, and they were terrified and crying out, "It's a ghost." Above all, Matthew wants to reassure his readers about Jesus' continuing influence in their lives. So Jesus speaks beautiful words to them, words of profound reassurance and comfort. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. In other words, keep on following me. Trust me. Remember all the things I have told you. But still, they have to put this to the test. And Peter represents all of us as he takes a few steps into risky territory, testing his faith in the God of Jesus. At first, he steps out boldly, his eyes fixed on Jesus. But when he allows the wind and waves, or the challenges of life, we might say, to distract him, they begin to overwhelm him. And in his fear, Peter cries out, "Save me!" Immediately, the reassuring hand reaches out and holds him. There is rebuke, but it is gentle. You of little faith, why did you doubt? When his followers are reconnected with their faith in God through Jesus, the threatening winds and sea die down. The metaphor of keeping faith in the God of Jesus on the sea of life is complete. The language of metaphor has heights and depths which ordinary prose cannot hope to reach. It draws the reader deep into the experience being described, and the words transcend time and space and life circumstances. The experience of the players in the story become the lived experience of the reader. Yet the language which transcends ordinary meaning also grounds the story in ordinary life. Jesus is not turned into something other than human. Jesus is not a magician who does marvelous tricks. He is the man in whom and through whom God spoke. The gospel writer knew that, and he chose the language of metaphor for very good reason. The word partnership describes very well our human relationship with God. We certainly need God, but God also needs us. If we respond to the invitation to live for the good of others, God will inspire us with a holy vision for life. And even if there is opposition to what we do, Jesus' influence reassures us that we can keep on. That is what the story says. For us, the winds and waves might be the skepticism of friends about why we keep belonging to the church. Or it might be disappointment that our own children have drifted away. Or it might be the changes we see in the church itself and our understanding of Jesus. Matthew, the gospel writer, used all the literary devices at his disposal to express the significance of Jesus' life and teachings for human relationships. We've got to remember that when the gospel was written, there was no TV cameras, there were no on-the-spot reporters, there were no printing presses, and it was oral communication. And the best way you could do that was with a story that touched people's lives. Jesus has a message that can defeat moral evil and transform the world. He knew that, and that's why he was willing to risk his own precious life. We can't even begin to imagine the horror and the brutality of crucifixion, and most Christians tend to brush over it, and we concentrate instead of the gee whiz miracles, or Jesus patting little children on the head, or perhaps Jesus riding on a donkey. But none of that sort of thing indicates what really inspired Jesus. Nothing in that tells us what gave Jesus courage to risk one of the most agonizing forms of execution. Following Jesus, the magician, the man who could actually walk in water, will only, I suggest, lead to disillusionment. But working with Jesus as a cooperative partner leads to personal growth and maturity. The story of Jesus walking on water acknowledges that following Jesus is not without risk and difficulty, but it also says that no matter how large the storms of life, none of his followers are separated from the inspiring strength of God. And by recalling Jesus' life and teachings, God continues to feed each one of us and inspire us for life today. Let us sing our next hymn.